blood soaked through the white silk glove before Evelina Ashworth could hide her hand beneath the table. She pressed her wrist against her stomach and smiled at the guests seated around her, hoping no one had seen. The Duke of Cambourne sat across from her, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes were fixed not on her face, but on the small dark stain spreading across her sleeve. She turned her arm away and reached for her water glass with the other hand. "Are you unwell, Lady Evelina?" asked her mother, seated at the head of the table, her voice sharp with warning rather than concern. "Only tired," Evelina said. "The wedding preparations, so many fittings." Her mother's eyes lingered on her a moment too long before returning to her plate. Evelina understood the look. It was not worry. It was a reminder. Smile. Say nothing. 6 more days. The dinner continued, but Evelina barely tasted the food in front of her. Her stomach had shrunk over the past weeks until even the smell of roasted meat made her feel ill. She used to love these dinners, the candlelight, the laughter of her younger sisters at the far end of the table. Now every meal felt like a performance she had to survive. She stole a glance at the Duke. Edmund Cambourne was not a man known for warmth. He had inherited his title young, after his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since building a reputation for cold efficiency rather than charm. Their engagement had been arranged 3 months earlier, a solution to 2 problems at once. Her family needed money. His estate needed an heir and a wife of good standing to secure his position among the older families who still doubted a duke who had come to his title so early. Neither of them had asked for love. But Evelina had not expected him to look at her the way he was looking at her now, as though he were solving a puzzle. "You should see a physician about your appetite," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "I have one," she said. "Dr. Whitfield visits twice a week." "And does he help?" She did not answer. The truth was too complicated to say at a dinner table, in front of her mother, in front of her stepbrother Julian, who sat 2 seats down, watching her with the same patient attention a hawk gives a mouse in an open field. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room. Evelina excused herself early, claiming a headache, and climbed the stairs to her bedroom with careful, measured steps. She had learned, over the past month, exactly how to walk so that nothing hurt more than it already did. Once her door was closed, she sat on the edge of her bed and peeled back the glove. The cut along her wrist had opened again. It was not deep, but it bled easily, the skin never given enough time to heal before something reopened it. She pressed a cloth against it and closed her eyes, waiting for the sting to pass. A knock came at the door. She quickly pulled her sleeve down and shoved the bloodied cloth beneath her pillow. "Yes?" Her lady's maid, Nora, stepped inside. Nora had been with the family for less than a month, hired suddenly after Evelina's previous maid, a woman named Margaret who had served her since childhood, was dismissed without warning or explanation. "Dr. Whitfield is here," Nora said. "Your mother says it is time for your evening tonic." Evelina's stomach tightened. "I already ate. I'm not unwell tonight. Your mother insists." There was no arguing with that. Evelina followed Nora down the back stairs to the small sitting room where Dr. Whitfield waited, his leather case open on the table, a small glass bottle already poured into a cup. "Good evening, Lady Evelina," the doctor said, his voice pleasant, almost kind. "How are we feeling?" "Tired," she said, the same word she had used all week. It was easier than the truth. "That is to be expected, with the wedding so close. This will help you rest." He held out the cup. She looked at the pale liquid inside it. Every time she drank it, the following hours blurred together, her thoughts slow and heavy, her limbs unwilling to obey her. She had stopped fighting the dizziness weeks ago. Fighting only made her mother angrier, and an angry mother meant Julian would be sent to help calm her down, and Julian's idea of calming her down left marks that took days to fade. "I would rather not tonight," she said. Dr. Whitfield's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "Lady Evelina, your wedding is in 6 days. We cannot have you appearing unwell in front of the Duke's family. This tonic settles the nerves, nothing more." She thought of the Duke watching her at dinner. "Are you unwell, Lady Evelina?" His voice had not been unkind. For a moment, she considered refusing again, considered walking straight past the doctor and out the door, finding the Duke, and telling him everything. But she had tried something like that once before, 3 weeks ago, when she had gone to her mother in tears and begged not to be forced into this. Her mother had listened, then called for Julian, and what happened after had taught Evelina exactly how far her family was willing to go to make sure the wedding happened. She drank the tonic. The room began to soften at the edges within minutes, the way it always did. Nora helped her back up the stairs, and Evelina remembered very little after that, only the feeling of her body being too heavy to lift, and a voice, perhaps her mother's, perhaps Julian's, saying something about the marriage settlement and how many days remained. She woke the next morning with a fresh bruise on her upper arm that she did not remember receiving. The wedding gown fitting was scheduled for that afternoon. Evelina stood on a small wooden platform in the drawing room while the seamstress pinned white silk along her waist, her sisters watching from the settee, delighted by the fabric, the lace, the promise of a duchess for a sister. "You'll be the most beautiful bride England has seen in years," her youngest sister Clara said, clapping her hands together. Evelina forced a smile. "Thank you, dearest." The seamstress reached for her arm to measure the sleeve length, and Evelina flinched before she could stop herself, pulling back sharply. "Forgive me, my lady," the seamstress said, startled. "Did I hurt you?" "No, I'm sorry. I was startled, that's all." But the sleeve had shifted, just slightly, and for half a second, before Evelina could adjust it, the edge of a bruise showed above her wrist, purple fading into yellow, the mark of fingers that had gripped too hard. The seamstress said nothing, her eyes flicking away quickly, the way servants learn to do in houses where certain things were not meant to be seen. But someone else had seen it too. The Duke of Cambourne stood in the doorway of the drawing room, having arrived early to discuss wedding arrangements with Evelina's mother, and he had paused there, unnoticed, at exactly the wrong moment. He said nothing. He did not step forward, did not announce his presence. He simply watched as Evelina pulled her sleeve back down over the bruise, watched the practiced, careful way she did it, the way someone does a thing they have done many times before. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway before anyone could realize he had seen anything at all. That evening, alone in his study, Edmund Cambourne poured himself a drink he did not touch and stared at the fire without seeing it. He thought of the blood on her sleeve at dinner. He thought of the bruise on her wrist. He thought of the way her whole family spoke about her as though she were a piece of furniture being delivered on schedule, valuable, fragile, but ultimately an object to be moved into place. He had agreed to this marriage for practical reasons. He had expected a quiet, arranged partnership, nothing more. He had not expected to feel something twist in his chest at the sight of a frightened young woman hiding wounds beneath silk gloves. He did not yet know what was happening inside the Ashworth household, but he intended to find out, and he intended to do it before the wedding, not after. He rang for his valet and gave a single instruction. "Send word to the stable master. I want the fastest horse ready at dawn. I am going to speak with someone in the village." His valet hesitated. "May I ask who, your grace?" Edmund's jaw tightened as he stared into the fire. "A woman named Margaret," he said. "Lady Evelina's former maid." Upstairs, Evelina lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. Her wrist throbbed beneath a fresh bandage she had wrapped herself, using strips torn from an old handkerchief, careful to keep the fabric hidden inside her sleeve so Nora would not report it to her mother in the morning. She thought about the Duke's question at dinner. "Are you unwell, Lady Evelina?" No one else at that table had asked her anything real in weeks. Her mother asked only whether she had eaten enough to look healthy for the wedding portraits. Julian asked nothing at all, only watched, the way he always watched, waiting for any sign that she might cause trouble before the settlement was signed. She did not know what to make of a man who noticed a bloodstain and did not look away. A soft knock came at her door, too late for Nora, too careful for her mother. Evelina sat up, heart pounding, and reached instinctively for the edge of her blanket, pulling it higher as though it could shield her. "Who is it?" The door opened slowly. It was Clara, her youngest sister, barefoot in her nightgown, a candle cupped in her small hands. "I couldn't sleep," Clara whispered, climbing onto the bed beside her, the way she had done since she was small enough to be frightened of thunderstorms. "Evie, are you truly happy about the wedding?" Evelina hesitated. Clara was only 11. She did not need to carry the weight of what was happening in this house. "Of course," Evelina said softly, smoothing her sister's hair. "The Duke seems a fair man. Mother says he's very rich. She says our troubles will be over once you're married." "Mother says a great many things." Clara studied her, with the particular honesty only children seem to possess. "You look tired all the time now. And thin. You used to laugh more." Evelina's throat tightened. "Weddings are tiring to plan, that's all." Clara did not look convinced, but she was too young to press further, and soon her eyes grew heavy, and she fell asleep curled against Evelina's side. Evelina stayed awake long after, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, counting the days until the wedding the way a prisoner might count days until a sentence ended, rather than a bride counting days until happiness began. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard footsteps pause outside her door, then move on. She did not know if it was Julian checking that she was still in her room, still accounted for, still on schedule. She had learned not to ask. Asking only invited answers she could not survive hearing. Tomorrow there would be another fitting, another tonic, another careful performance at another meal. But for the first time in weeks, as she finally drifted toward sleep, Evelina found herself thinking not of her mother's warnings or Julian's cold patience, but of a duke who had looked at her wrist and had not looked away. She did not yet know if that meant anything at all, but it was the first time in a long while that she had allowed herself to hope it might. Edmund left before sunrise, riding hard against a cold wind, following directions his valet had gathered from the household staff without raising suspicion. The village of Marrow's End sat 2 hours from the Ashworth estate, a cluster of cottages along a narrow river, smoke rising from chimneys as the morning began. He found the cottage easily enough, small and neat, a woman's garden already tended despite the early hour. When he knocked, the door opened only a crack. "We want nothing," a voice said, sharp with suspicion. "Whatever you're selling, we haven't the coin." "I am not selling anything," Edmund said. "I am looking for a woman named Margaret, who served as lady's maid to Lady Evelina Ashworth." The door stopped moving. Through the narrow gap, a pair of eyes studied him carefully, taking in the quality of his coat, the crest on his signet ring. Why would a duke want anything with Margaret Finch? "Because I am the man she is set to marry into," Edmund said. "The Duke of Cambourne. I am to marry Lady Evelina in 6 days, and I have questions that no one in that house seems willing to answer." The door opened fully. The woman standing there was perhaps 50, her hands rough with years of work, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had not slept well in some time. "Come in then," she said, quickly, "before someone sees a duke's carriage outside my door and decides to ask why." Inside, the cottage was small but clean, a fire burning low in the hearth. Margaret Finch sat across from him at a wooden table and folded her hands tightly, as though holding herself together by force. "I served that family for 11 years, she said. "I dressed Lady Evelina since she was a girl of 9. I would have stayed until she had children of her own, God willing. Then one morning I was told my services were no longer required, no warning, no reason given, just a purse of coin and a carriage to take me to the village." "When was this?" 6 weeks ago, around the same time the engagement was announced. Edmund leaned forward. "And you know nothing of why?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "I know things, Your Grace, that I have been too frightened to say aloud. Lady Ashworth's family has powerful friends. If word got back that I had spoken against them, my sister's family in the village could lose their lease on the mill. We depend on that income. I will protect you and your family, if what you tell me is the truth. You have my word as a duke, and my word has never yet been broken." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then seemed to reach some decision within herself. She rose, checked that the door was firmly shut, and sat back down, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Lady Evelina did not want this marriage at first. Not because of you, Your Grace. She knew nothing of you beyond your name. She did not want to be married off like cargo to settle her stepfather's gambling debts. She said so, to her mother, quite plainly, the week before the engagement was announced." "Her stepfather?" "The late Mr. Ashworth was not her true father. Lady Evelina's mother remarried when the girl was small. Mr. Ashworth left considerable debts when he passed 2 years ago, debts his son Julian inherited along with the estate, though not the title, since Julian is no blood relation to any peerage. Julian has been bleeding the estate dry ever since, and there is little left beyond what Lady Evelina's marriage will bring in." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Go on." "When Lady Evelina refused the match, there was a terrible argument. I was not permitted to stay in the room, but I heard raised voices, and I heard Lady Evelina crying afterward, the kind of crying that comes from more than sadness. The next morning, she would not let me help her dress. She kept her arms covered, would not let me near her wrists. I have dressed that girl 1,000 times, Your Grace. I know the shape of every scar on her hands from childhood scrapes. What I saw that morning was new, and it was not from any childhood accident." Edmund felt something cold settle in his chest. "You believe someone hurt her?" "I believe someone convinced her, quite forcefully, that refusing this marriage was not a choice she was permitted to make, and 3 days later, I was dismissed and replaced with a girl named Nora, who I am told does exactly as she is instructed and asks no questions." "Why would her own family do this to her?" Margaret's expression turned bitter. Because a duke's settlement, your grace, is worth far more than a daughter's happiness to some people. Julian Ashworth stands to inherit nothing once the family debts are settled, and Lady Evelina is married off and gone from the household. His only path to comfort is ensuring this wedding happens, and happens without complication. A frightened, obedient bride causes no complications. A bride who might run, or speak to her intended, or refuse at the altar, causes a great many. Edmund sat back, his mind working quickly through everything he had seen over the past weeks. The blood on her sleeve, the bruise at the fitting, her flinching at sudden movement, her mother's sharp warnings disguised as concern, Dr. Whitfield's tonics, administered against her will. "There is a physician," he said slowly. "Dr. Whitfield. He visits the house often." Margaret's face paled further. "I know him. He was called in the week I was dismissed. I do not know what he gives her, but I know Lady Evelina was never unwell before he began his visits. She was strong. She rode horses, walked for miles, laughed louder than anyone in that house. Whatever he has been giving her, it has changed her into someone I would not have recognized." Edmund stood, his hands clenched at his sides. "I intend to end this before the wedding, Mrs. Finch. But I need proof that would hold against people who have clearly planned this carefully. Accusations alone will not be enough against a family with connections. Then you must be careful, your grace. If they suspect you know, they may move faster than you expect. A wedding pushed forward by even a few days could ruin whatever chance you have to intervene." Edmund thanked her, promised again that her family's position in the village would remain secure regardless of what happened, and rode back toward the Ashworth estate with a plan already forming in his mind. He would need to see Dr. Whitfield's tonic tested. He would need to speak with Evelina directly, away from her mother's watchful presence, and he would need to do it soon. He arrived back at his own estate by early afternoon, exhausted from the ride but unwilling to rest. He called for his personal physician, a man he trusted completely, and gave him a single instruction: prepare to travel to the Ashworth estate under the guise of a social visit, and be ready to examine anything Edmund managed to bring him. That evening, an invitation arrived at the Ashworth household. The Duke of Cambourne requested a private walk in the garden with his intended bride the following afternoon, to discuss wedding arrangements before the ceremony. It was a reasonable request, the sort any groom might make in the final days before his wedding. Lady Ashworth read the letter twice, her expression unreadable, before passing it to her daughter across the breakfast table. "You will go, of course," she said, "and you will be pleasant. Whatever concerns the Duke, you will address them cheerfully. Do you understand me, Evelina?" Evelina looked at the letter, at the Duke's careful, formal handwriting requesting simply to walk with her, and felt something she had not felt in weeks. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to curiosity, and beneath it, a fragile thread of hope she did not dare examine too closely. "I understand," she said. Across the table, Julian watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, saying nothing, though his fingers drummed once against the wood before he rose and left the room without another word. The following afternoon arrived gray and quiet, clouds hanging low over the estate gardens where roses grew in careful rows along gravel paths. Evelina waited near the fountain, dressed in pale blue, her gloves fastened tightly at the wrist despite the mild weather. She had chosen the thickest pair she owned. Edmund arrived precisely on time, dismissing the footman who trailed behind him with a small gesture, ensuring they would speak without an audience close enough to overhear. "Lady Evelina," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you for agreeing to walk with me." "Of course, your grace. Mother insisted I be available." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she winced slightly at her own honesty. If Edmund noticed, he did not react with anything but mild amusement. "I imagine your mother insists on a great many things." They walked in silence for several minutes, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, the garden otherwise still except for birdsong and the distant sound of a groundskeeper trimming hedges near the far wall. "I wanted to ask you something," Edmund said finally, his tone careful, as though testing the ground before stepping onto it fully. "And I would ask that you answer honestly, without concern for what you believe I wish to hear." Evelina's steps slowed slightly. "You may ask, your grace. Are you happy about this marriage?" The question hung in the air between them. Evelina had prepared 100 answers for 100 imagined conversations, all of them careful, all of them designed to protect the fragile arrangement her family depended on. But something in the Duke's steady gaze made the rehearsed words feel impossible to say. "I am grateful for the security it will bring my family," she said carefully. "That is not what I asked." She looked away, toward the roses, unable to meet his eyes. "What does it matter, your grace? The arrangements are made, the date is set. My happiness was never a requirement for either of our families. It matters to me, Edmund said quietly, and something in his voice made her look back at him in surprise. I did not expect it to. When this engagement was first arranged, I assumed we would build a practical partnership, nothing more, and that would have been sufficient. But I find I cannot simply ignore what I have observed these past weeks. Evelina's heart began to pound. I do not know what you mean. I think you do. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. I saw the blood on your sleeve at dinner 3 nights ago. I saw the bruise on your wrist at the fitting yesterday. I have spoken with your former maid, Margaret Finch, who was dismissed the week you tried to refuse this marriage. The color drained from Evelina's face. She stepped back instinctively, her hand rising to her chest as though she could hold her racing heart still through sheer will. You had no right. I had every right, as the man about to marry you, to understand why my intended bride flinches when anyone touches her sleeve and hides blood beneath silk gloves. His voice was firm but not unkind. Evelina, whatever is happening in that house, you do not have to face it alone anymore. Tears filled her eyes despite every effort to hold them back. You don't understand what you're asking. If they learn that I've spoken to you, if they even suspect, then we will be careful. But I need you to trust me enough to tell me the truth. Show me your wrist. She hesitated, glancing back toward the house, half expecting to see Julian watching from a window, though the gardens were empty except for the 2 of them, and the distant groundskeeper too far away to hear. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she began unfastening the small buttons at her glove's wrist. Edmund waited without moving, without pressing her further, giving her the choice that no one else in her life had given her in weeks. When the glove finally slipped away, the marks beneath were unmistakable even in the pale afternoon light. Fingerprint bruises, dark purple fading to sickly yellow at the edges, wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet no jeweler had ever crafted. Beneath them, a thin, half-healed cut ran along the inside of her forearm, the kind of wound that came from repeated reopening rather than a single injury. Edmund's expression darkened, though his hands remained gentle as he took her wrist carefully, turning it slightly to examine the marks without causing further pain. Who did this to you? Evelina's voice broke as the tears finally spilled over. Please, Your Grace. Please don't ask me that yet. If I tell you now, and you cannot stop the wedding in time, everything will only become worse for me. I need you to trust that I will tell you everything, but I need more time. Edmund studied her face for a long moment, torn between the fury building in his chest and the fear plain in her eyes. 6 days, he said finally. The wedding is in 6 days. I will not force answers from you today, but I will not stand by and let this continue either. I am going to find proof of what is happening in that house, and when I have it, we will end this together. Do you understand me? Together. Evelina nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, as Edmund gently refastened her glove over the bruises, hiding them once more from view, though something between them had shifted permanently in the doing of it. As they turned to walk back toward the house, neither of them noticed the curtain shifting in an upstairs window, nor the figure standing just behind it, watching the entire exchange with cold, calculating eyes. Julian Ashworth let the curtain fall back into place and turned from the window, already moving toward his study, already composing the letter he intended to send to Dr. Whitfield that very evening. If the Duke was asking questions, the timeline would need to change. The wedding could not wait a full 6 days any longer. Julian's letter reached Dr. Whitfield's residence in the village just after nightfall. The physician read it twice by candlelight, his expression tightening with each line, before folding it carefully and feeding it to the fire in his study. He had known this arrangement carried risk from the beginning. When Julian Ashworth first approached him 4 months earlier, offering a substantial sum in exchange for medical discretion regarding Lady Evelina's condition, Dr. Whitfield had told himself it was a small compromise, a mild sedative, nothing dangerous, simply enough to keep a reluctant bride calm and cooperative until the marriage settlement was secured. He had performed worse services for wealthier families over the years and slept soundly enough afterward. But calm and cooperative had required increasing doses as the weeks passed, as Evelina's resistance proved stronger than either man had anticipated. What began as a mild tonic had become something considerably more potent, administered with increasing frequency, and Dr. Whitfield had begun to notice the toll it was taking on her body, the weight loss, the exhaustion, the way her hands had started trembling even when she was not under the tonic's influence. He told himself it would end the moment the wedding vows were spoken. After that, she would be the Duke's responsibility, and whatever arrangement existed between himself and Julian Ashworth would simply dissolve, unremarkable and unremembered. Now, staring at the ashes of Julian's letter curling in the fireplace, he understood that timeline had just collapsed. The following morning, Dr. Whitfield arrived at the Ashworth estate earlier than his usual schedule, his leather case heavier than normal, containing a new bottle he had prepared through the night. Evelina was summoned from her breakfast before she had finished eating, Nora appearing at her side with an apologetic expression that suggested she, too, understood something had changed. "The doctor insists it cannot wait," Nora whispered as she guided Evelina toward the sitting room. Inside, Lady Ashworth was already present, standing near the window with her arms crossed, her expression sharper than Evelina had seen it in weeks. "Sit down," her mother said, and Evelina obeyed, sensing immediately that whatever conversation was about to happen carried more weight than any tonic session before it. "Your walk with the Duke yesterday," her mother began, "was observed." Evelina's stomach dropped. "Mother, it was only a walk. He asked about the wedding arrangements." "Do not lie to me." Her mother's voice cracked like a whip across the quiet room. "Julian saw everything, the glove, the conversation. Whatever you told that man, you have put this entire family in jeopardy." "I told him nothing," Evelina said, her voice shaking. "He guessed. He noticed things on his own. I never meant." "It does not matter what you meant." Her mother crossed the room in 3 sharp strides, gripping Evelina's chin and forcing her to look up. "We have worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to have you ruin everything now, days before the wedding, because you could not control your own weakness." Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat gently from the doorway. "Lady Ashworth, if I may. Perhaps a stronger dosage, administered more consistently over the remaining days, would ensure Lady Evelina remains settled and cooperative through the ceremony itself. It would also, I should note, make any further conversations with the Duke considerably less likely to produce complications." Evelina's blood ran cold. "You mean to keep me sedated until the wedding?" "We mean to ensure this family's survival," her mother said coldly. "Something you seem determined to forget every time a handsome Duke pays you the smallest attention." The dosage that followed was stronger than anything Evelina had experienced before. Within the hour, the world had softened into something distant and unreal, her thoughts moving like syrup through her mind, her limbs heavy and unwilling to respond to her wishes. She was aware, distantly, of being helped to her room, of the curtains being drawn against the daylight, of Nora's worried face hovering somewhere above her before the darkness took her fully under. She did not wake until the following morning, and when she did, an entire day had disappeared from her memory, swallowed whole by whatever Dr. Whitfield had given her. Meanwhile, Edmund had spent that same day pursuing a different path entirely. His personal physician, Dr. Alistair Wren, a man he had known and trusted since childhood, arrived at Cambourne Hall by mid-morning, and the 2 men spent hours discussing what symptoms Edmund had observed. The exhaustion, the weight loss, the trembling hands, the confusion after certain visits, Dr. Wren said, pacing slowly across Edmund's study. "It could be illness, certainly. But paired with what you've described regarding this Dr. Whitfield's frequent visits and mysterious tonics, I would want to examine whatever he is administering before drawing conclusions. How would I obtain a sample without raising suspicion?" Dr. Wren considered this carefully. "You mentioned Lady Evelina's maid has been replaced with someone new, someone loyal to the family's wishes rather than to her. Is there any other servant in that household who might sympathize with Lady Evelina's situation?" Edmund thought of the footman who had trailed behind him during the garden walk, dismissed with a simple gesture, and of the many small interactions he had observed over the past months, servants exchanging worried glances whenever Lady Evelina's name arose in conversation. "There may be someone," he said slowly. "The head housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce. She has served that family for over 20 years. I recall Lady Evelina mentioning once that Mrs. Pierce used to sneak her sweets from the kitchen as a child, when her mother forbade such things. There may be genuine affection there. Then I would suggest reaching out to her, carefully, through whatever means avoid drawing attention. If she can obtain even a small sample of what this physician is administering, I can identify its contents within a day." Edmund wasted no time. That evening he sent a discreet message through a trusted stable hand who had connections in the Ashworth household staff, requesting a quiet meeting with Mrs. Pierce at the edge of the property, away from the main house, under cover of darkness. The housekeeper arrived cloaked and nervous, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder as she approached the designated meeting point near an old stone wall bordering the estate's eastern edge. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular," she said, though she did not turn to leave. "I understand the risk I am asking you to take, Mrs. Pierce, but I believe Lady Evelina is in genuine danger within her own household, and I need your help to prove it before the wedding takes place." Mrs. Pierce's composure cracked slightly at the mention of danger, years of carefully maintained professional distance giving way to something rawer and more honest. "I have watched that girl grow up, Your Grace. I dressed her scraped knees when she was small enough to fall from the garden trees. I have watched her disappear these past months into someone I barely recognize, and I have said nothing, because I feared for my position, and for my own family who depend on my wages. I am not asking you to risk everything at once. I am asking for a small sample of whatever Dr. Whitfield administers to her, enough for my own physician to examine." Mrs. Pierce was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the distant lights of the main house. "There is a bottle kept in the sitting room cabinet, refilled each week by the doctor himself. I could take a small amount without it being noticed, if I am careful." "Thank you, truly. Do not thank me yet, Your Grace. If they discover what I have done, I will lose more than my position. Julian Ashworth is not a forgiving man, and Lady Ashworth values her family's reputation above almost anything, including, I fear, her own daughter's well-being. I will protect you, exactly as I have promised to protect Margaret Finch. You have my word." Mrs. Pierce nodded slowly, seeming to draw some measure of confidence from his certainty. "Give me 2 days, Your Grace. I will find a way." 2 days felt like an eternity given how quickly circumstances seemed to be shifting within the Ashworth household, but Edmund had no choice except to wait, to trust the small network of allies he had begun to build, and to continue his outward performance as an eager, unsuspecting groom preparing for his wedding. That performance grew more difficult with each passing day. When he called at the Ashworth estate 2 days later under the pretense of discussing final wedding arrangements, he found Evelina changed in ways that alarmed him deeply. Her eyes had a distant, unfocused quality he had not seen before. Her responses to his questions came slowly, as though each word required considerable effort to locate and speak aloud. Her hands trembled visibly as she reached for her teacup, and twice she nearly knocked it from the table entirely. "Are you quite well, Lady Evelina?" he asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice despite Lady Ashworth's presence in the room. "I am simply tired, Your Grace," Evelina said, the words slurring slightly at their edges. "The wedding preparations are considerable." Lady Ashworth smiled thinly from her seat near the fireplace. "Brides are often overwhelmed in these final days. It is nothing a good rest will not cure." Edmund said nothing further on the matter, but as he took his leave that afternoon, he caught Evelina's eyes for just a moment, and saw something desperate and pleading beneath the fog clouding her expression. She was still in there, still aware enough to be frightened, still fighting against whatever was being done to her, even as her body grew less capable of resisting it. He rode back to Cambourne Hall with grim determination hardening in his chest. Whatever proof Mrs. Pierce managed to obtain would need to come soon. Evelina did not have the luxury of time, and neither, it seemed, did he. 2 nights later, a small parcel arrived at Cambourne Hall, delivered by the same trusted stable hand, wrapped carefully in cloth and containing a small vial of pale liquid, along with a hastily written note from Mrs. Pierce confirming she had taken the sample without detection, though the doctor had refilled the bottle again that very morning, suggesting the dosages were only increasing as the wedding drew closer. Edmund delivered the vial to Dr. Wren immediately, and the physician promised results within a day. The results, when they arrived, confirmed everything Edmund had feared and more. The tonic contained a significant quantity of laudanum, far exceeding any reasonable medicinal dose, combined with other sedating compounds that, taken together over weeks at increasing strength, could cause exactly the symptoms Edmund had observed: the exhaustion, the trembling, the confusion and memory loss. Continued at the current dosage, Dr. Wren warned gravely, the combination carried genuine risk to Evelina's health, risk that would only increase the longer it continued. "This is not medicine, Edmund," Dr. Wren said, his expression grave as he set the analysis aside. "This is a means of control, administered by a man who has clearly abandoned any pretense of medical ethics in exchange for whatever payment he is receiving. If this continues at its current pace, I cannot guarantee her safety, wedding or no wedding." Edmund stared at the written analysis in his hands, feeling the full weight of what he now understood settle over him like a physical burden. He had his proof. What remained was deciding exactly how, and when, to use it, in a way that would save Evelina rather than simply exposing a scandal that her family's connections might yet find a way to survive. The wedding was now only 4 days away, and Julian Ashworth, sensing the walls closing in around his careful arrangement, was already preparing to move faster than anyone had anticipated. That same evening, Julian summoned Dr. Whitfield to a private meeting in his study, the door locked, the curtains drawn despite the early hour. "The Duke visited again today," Florian said, pacing behind his desk. "My stepsister could barely form a sentence. If he suspects the tonic is affecting her this severely, he may act before the wedding, rather than waiting." "The dosage is already at its safest reasonable limit," Dr. Whitfield replied, though his voice carried less confidence than it once had. "Increasing it further carries genuine risk to her health, Mr. Ashworth. I have told you this before. Her health is not my primary concern at present. This family's survival is." Julian stopped pacing and fixed the doctor with a hard stare. "I have decided to move the wedding forward. 2 days, not 4. If she is barely conscious enough to speak her vows, all the better. It removes any opportunity for further complications." Dr. Whitfield's face paled. "Moving a wedding forward by 2 days without explanation will draw questions from the Duke's household, from the clergy, from half the guests already invited. Then we shall explain it as eagerness. A groom, too besotted to wait. A bride, too excited to delay her happiness any further. People believe romantic explanations far more readily than they question them." Julian's smile carried no warmth whatsoever. "You will prepare whatever is necessary to ensure she remains calm and cooperative through the ceremony. That is all I require of you." Dr. Whitfield left the meeting with a knot of dread forming in his stomach that no amount of rationalization could fully dissolve. He had told himself many times over the past months that this arrangement was simply business, unpleasant but ultimately survivable for everyone involved. Standing now on the threshold of accelerating a scheme that could genuinely endanger a young woman's life, he found that rationalization increasingly difficult to maintain. Upstairs, in a rare moment of clarity between doses, Evelina sat by her window and watched the last light fade from the sky. The fog in her mind had lifted slightly this evening, whether through some natural resistance building in her body or simply the timing between doses, and she used the precious clarity to think as clearly as she could manage about her situation. She thought of Edmund's face in the garden, the careful way he had asked to see her wrist rather than simply taking it, the promise in his voice when he said they would end this together. She believed him, or wanted to believe him, in a way she had not allowed herself to trust anyone in her own family for weeks. But belief alone would not be enough if she could not find some way to reach him before whatever her family was planning took its final shape. She rose unsteadily from her chair and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of her room, retrieving a sheet of paper and a pen with hands that still trembled slightly from the day's dosage. She wrote quickly, before the clarity could fade again, a brief message with no signature, folding it small enough to hide within her palm. The following morning, when Nora arrived to help her dress, Evelina pressed a small coin into the maid's hand along with the folded paper. "Please," she whispered, "I know you are meant to report everything to my mother, but I am asking you, as one person to another, to deliver this instead, not to her, to the stable hand who delivers messages between here and Camborden Hall. Please." Nora hesitated, glancing toward the door as though expecting Lady Ashworth to appear at any moment. "My lady, if I am discovered, I know what I am asking of you. I know the risk, but I have no one else to ask, and I am running out of time." Evelina's eyes filled with tears, the genuine desperation in her voice apparently reaching something within the young maid that her weeks of careful obedience had not fully extinguished. Nora's fingers closed around the folded paper. "I will try, my lady. I can promise nothing more than that." The message reached Cambourne Hall by midday, delivered quietly by the stable hand who had become an unwitting but essential link between the two households. Edmund unfolded the small paper with careful hands, his heart tightening as he read the few desperate lines written there. "They mean to move the wedding forward. 2 days, not 4. I do not know what else they plan. Please, if you intend to help me, do not wait for the day we agreed upon. I do not know how much longer I can endure what they are doing to me." Edmund read the message twice, then called immediately for Dr. Wren and for his own solicitor, understanding now that whatever plan he had been slowly building needed to accelerate dramatically. There would be no more careful, patient gathering of evidence over the coming days. Whatever he intended to do, he would need to do it soon, publicly enough that Julian Ashworth and Dr. Whitfield could not simply explain away the truth once it emerged. "We move tomorrow," Edmund told his solicitor, a sharp, careful man named Frederick Lowell, who had served the Cambourne family for over a decade. "I want you present at the Ashworth estate, prepared with whatever legal authority you can gather regarding fraud and endangerment. Dr. Wren, I want you present as well, ready to examine Lady Evelina immediately, and confirm what has been done to her." "Your Grace," Lowell said carefully, "confronting a family of this standing without absolute certainty could create considerable scandal, for them, and potentially for you as well, should the accusations prove difficult to prove definitively in the moment. Edmund's expression hardened with a resolve that left no room for further argument. I have the physician's analysis of the tonic. I have testimony from a dismissed maid and a current housekeeper willing to speak, should it come to that. And I have watched a young woman deteriorate in front of me over these past weeks, while her own family called it nerves and exhaustion. I am done waiting for absolute certainty, Lowell. Tomorrow, we act. That night, sleep found none of them easily. In her room at the Ashworth estate, Evelina lay awake wondering if her message had reached its destination, or if it had been intercepted, or if Edmund would simply be too late regardless. In his study at Cambourne Hall, Edmund reviewed Dr. Wren's analysis for perhaps the 20th time, committing every detail to memory for what tomorrow would demand of him. And in his own chambers, Julian Ashworth slept soundly, entirely unaware that the careful timeline he had constructed was about to collapse far sooner than even his accelerated plans had anticipated. The final gown fitting was scheduled for the following afternoon, moved forward along with the wedding date itself, a flurry of hurried preparations descending on the Ashworth household as seamstresses and florists and caterers scrambled to accommodate the sudden change. Evelina stood once again on the small wooden platform in the drawing room, the white silk gown now fully assembled, layers of lace cascading around her thin frame, in a way that would have looked beautiful on a body not visibly wasting beneath it. She had received another dose that morning, stronger than the day before, and the world had taken on the familiar soft, distant quality that made standing upright feel like an achievement rather than a simple physical act. "Just the sleeves left to finish, my lady," the seamstress murmured, kneeling to pin the fabric at Evelina's wrist. The pin caught against skin already raw from days of hidden bandaging, reopening the thin cut along her forearm that had never been given proper time to heal. Evelina felt the sharp sting, but her reflexes, dulled by the tonic, responded too slowly to hide it. Blood welled up quickly, staining through the white silk in a small but unmistakable red bloom. "Oh," the seamstress gasped, pulling back. "My lady, you're bleeding." The commotion drew attention from across the room, where Lady Ashworth had been discussing flower arrangements with a hired florist. She crossed quickly, her expression tightening with barely contained panic rather than concern. "It's nothing," Lady Ashworth said sharply, reaching for Evelina's arm. "A pinprick. Fetch a cloth." But it was at that exact moment that the drawing room doors opened, and Edmund Cambourne walked in unannounced, exactly 1 hour earlier than his scheduled arrival, flanked by Dr. Wren and Frederick Lowell, both men carrying leather cases that suggested this was no ordinary social call. Edmund's eyes went immediately to the blood soaking through Evelina's sleeve, to her glazed, unfocused expression, to the way she swayed slightly on the platform as though standing required conscious, difficult effort. "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth said, color draining from her face. "We were not expecting you until—" "I am aware I am early," Edmund said, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced the room instantly. "I find myself unable to wait any longer, given what I have learned about my intended bride's condition." Julian appeared in the doorway behind him, having heard the commotion from his study, and his eyes narrowed sharply as he took in the scene before him. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular," Julian said, stepping forward with forced calm. "Whatever concerns you may have, surely they can wait until a more appropriate—" "They cannot wait," Edmund interrupted, crossing the room directly to where Evelina still stood on the platform, blood continuing to seep through her sleeve. "Dr. Wren, if you would." Dr. Wren moved forward immediately, gently taking Evelina's arm to examine the wound, his trained eyes taking in far more than the simple cut, noting her dilated pupils, the tremor in her hands, the slow, delayed way she attempted to focus on the faces around her. "This wound has been reopened repeatedly over an extended period," Dr. Wren said, his voice carrying clearly across the tense room. "It has never been permitted to fully heal. And these symptoms, Your Grace, are entirely consistent with significant sustained sedation." "How dare you," Lady Ashworth began, her voice rising, "bring your physician into my home to examine my daughter without permission?" "Permission," Edmund said, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade, "was never given by Evelina herself, for whatever has been done to her over these past months. I have that permission now, and I intend to use it." He reached into his coat and withdrew Dr. Wren's written analysis, holding it out where Lady Ashworth and Julian could both see it clearly. "This is an analysis of the tonic Dr. Whitfield has been administering to Lady Evelina, obtained and examined 3 days ago. It contains laudanum in quantities far exceeding any reasonable medicinal purpose, combined with additional sedating compounds. Administered consistently, at increasing dosages, over the timeline I understand this has been occurring. It explains every symptom I have personally witnessed in your daughter over these past weeks. Julian's composure cracked visibly for the first time. You have no proof of when or how that sample was obtained, or that it accurately represents. I also have testimony, Frederick Lowell said, stepping forward with his own leather case, from Margaret Finch, dismissed from this household the week Lady Evelina attempted to refuse this engagement. And from Mrs. Pierce, your current housekeeper, who provided the sample the Duke's physician examined, and who is prepared to testify to what she has personally witnessed within this household over recent months, should this matter proceed to formal inquiry. The room fell into stunned silence. Evelina, still swaying slightly on the platform, looked between the Duke and her mother and Julian with an expression caught somewhere between fear and dawning, disbelieving relief. This is absurd, Lady Ashworth said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier authority. My daughter has been unwell. Weddings are stressful for young women. Dr. Whitfield is a respected physician who has treated this family for years. Dr. Whitfield, Edmund said, will shortly find himself unable to practice medicine anywhere in England once the appropriate medical board reviews this analysis, alongside sworn testimony regarding what he has knowingly administered and why. Julian's expression shifted rapidly from indignation to something colder and more calculating, his mind clearly working through possible avenues of escape from a situation collapsing faster than he had anticipated. Your Grace, surely we can discuss this privately, as reasonable men, without dragging this family's name through. There is nothing reasonable, Edmund said, his voice finally breaking with the fury he had been carefully controlling since walking through the door, about drugging a young woman into compliance to secure a marriage settlement for debts you personally accumulated. There is nothing reasonable about dismissing her lifelong maid for daring to notice bruises on her wrists. There is nothing reasonable about anything that has happened in this house over these past months, and I will not discuss it privately as though it were a matter of simple family discretion. Evelina, still standing on the platform, felt her legs finally give way beneath the combined weight of the tonic and the overwhelming emotion of the moment. She stumbled forward, and Edmund caught her before she could fall, his arms steady around her despite the barely controlled anger still radiating through his frame. I have you, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. You do not need to stand any longer. I have you now. Evelina, her vision blurring between exhaustion, sedation, and tears she could no longer hold back, allowed herself finally to lean into his support, the fight draining out of her body now that she was no longer facing it entirely alone. Get her away from him, Lady Ashworth said suddenly, some final desperate authority returning to her voice as she gestured toward Julian. This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved. No one, Edmund said, his voice carrying an absolute finality that ended the conversation entirely, is taking her anywhere except somewhere she can properly recover, under a physician's genuine care, away from this household entirely. Dr. Wren, is she fit to travel a short distance? Dr. Wren examined her briefly once more, checking her pulse, her pupils, the steadiness of her breathing. With careful handling, yes. I would recommend removing her from any further exposure to whatever has been administered as quickly as possible. Then we leave now. Edmund lifted Evelina carefully, cradling her against his chest, as though she weighed nothing at all, her wedding gown still trailing white silk and lace around them both, the small bloodstain on her sleeve a stark reminder of exactly what this household had been willing to do to secure its survival. Julian stepped forward as though to block their path, his expression twisting with barely restrained desperation. You cannot simply remove her from her own family's care without— I can, and I am, Edmund said, not slowing his stride toward the door. Frederick, I trust you to handle whatever formal legal proceedings become necessary regarding fraud, endangerment, and whatever additional charges the authorities determine appropriate once Dr. Wren's full findings and the servants' testimonies are formally recorded. Frederick Lowell nodded firmly, already withdrawing paper from his case to begin documenting the scene before them. As Edmund carried Evelina from the drawing room, past the stunned florist and seamstress who had witnessed the entire confrontation, past Lady Ashworth's continued protests fading into desperate, increasingly hollow arguments, Evelina turned her face against his shoulder, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to believe that whatever came next might genuinely be safety, rather than simply a different shape of danger. Behind them, Julian Ashworth stood frozen in the drawing room doorway, watching his carefully constructed arrangement collapse entirely in the span of a single afternoon, and understanding, with dawning horror, exactly how completely his own actions had ensured his downfall. The carriage ride to Camborne Hall passed in near silence, Evelina drifting in and out of clarity against Edmund's shoulder while Dr. Wren monitored her pulse and breathing with quiet professional focus. By the time they arrived, servants had already been alerted to prepare a guest chamber, warm and comfortable, far removed from anything resembling the room she had spent the past months trapped within. Edmund carried her inside himself, refusing offers of assistance from his staff, and did not leave her side until Dr. Wren had completed a full examination and confirmed there was nothing requiring more urgent intervention than rest, proper nourishment, and time for whatever remained of the tonic to fully leave her system. She will need several days before the sedation clears entirely, Dr. Wren said quietly, speaking to Edmund in the hallway outside the guest chamber once Evelina had finally fallen into genuine natural sleep rather than the drugged unconsciousness she had known for weeks. Her body has been under considerable strain. But she is young and otherwise healthy beneath the exhaustion. With proper care, I expect a full recovery. Thank you, Edmund said, relief evident in his voice for the first time since the confrontation at the Ashworth estate, for everything you have done these past days. You should thank yourself, Your Grace. Not every man in your position would have noticed what you noticed, or acted on it as swiftly as you did once you understood the truth. Dr. Wren studied him for a moment with quiet curiosity. May I ask what prompted such attention, so early in an arranged engagement? Many men in your position would have simply proceeded with the wedding, undisturbed by whatever difficulties their intended bride happened to be facing privately. Edmund considered the question seriously, his gaze drifting toward the closed door behind which Evelina now slept peacefully for what he suspected was the first time in a very long while. I am not entirely certain, if I am honest. Something in her expression that first evening, I think. She was trying so hard to hide her suffering behind politeness, behind performance, and something about that effort struck me as deeply wrong. I could not simply look away once I had noticed it. Dr. Wren nodded slowly, offering no further comment, though something in his expression suggested he understood there was more to the Duke's answer than either man was prepared to fully examine at that particular moment. Over the following 2 days, Evelina slowly returned to herself, the fog of sedation clearing gradually, as the compounds finally worked their way out of her system. She woke each morning slightly more clear-eyed than the day before, slightly steadier on her feet, slowly rediscovering an appetite that had abandoned her for weeks under her family's careful management. Edmund visited her chamber each day, never staying longer than her strength allowed, never pressing for the full account of what had happened before she was ready to give it. He brought books from his library, fresh flowers from the gardens, small kindnesses that asked nothing of her in return beyond her presence and her continued recovery. On the 3rd day, sitting up in bed with color finally returning to her cheeks, Evelina found herself ready, for the first time, to speak the truth she had been too frightened and too exhausted to voice fully before. I need to tell you everything, she said, as Edmund settled into the chair beside her bed. Not the fragments you have already pieced together, everything, from the beginning. Edmund nodded, folding his hands in his lap, offering her his complete attention without any hint of impatience. I am listening. Take whatever time you need. Evelina took a steadying breath, and for the first time in months, began to speak without fear of what the words might cost her. My stepfather died 2 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the memory. He left considerable debts behind, far more than anyone in the family realized while he lived. Julian inherited the estate's management, though not the title, since he shares no blood with the peerage on his father's side. He has spent these 2 years trying desperately to hide how badly the family's finances had deteriorated, borrowing against future income, delaying payments, presenting a face of comfortable stability to the world, while everything behind that face slowly collapsed. And your marriage was meant to solve that. When your family's solicitor first approached mine about a potential match, Julian saw an opportunity too valuable to lose. A Duke's settlement, paid upon marriage, would clear every debt the family carried, and leave considerable surplus besides. He pressed my mother relentlessly to secure the arrangement, and she, desperate to preserve whatever remained of our family's standing, agreed without truly considering what it would mean for me personally. You told your mother you did not want the marriage. Evelina's hands twisted in her lap. I did, the week the engagement was announced. I did not know you at all, Your Grace, and the thought of being given away like property to settle debts I had no part in creating felt unbearable. I told my mother plainly that I would not go through with it, that she should find another way to address the family's finances. What happened? She was furious. I had never seen her so angry. She called for Julian, and he came into the room, and between the two of them, I was made to understand, very clearly, that refusing was simply not an option available to me. Evelina's voice trembled slightly, though she pressed forward, determined now to finish the account she had begun. Julian gripped my arm hard enough to bruise, told me that if I embarrassed this family by refusing a duke's proposal, I would regret it far more than I could currently imagine. My mother stood by and said nothing to stop him. That was the first time, though it was not the last. Edmund's jaw tightened, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. Margaret, my maid, noticed the bruises the following morning. She asked no questions, but I could see the concern in her face, and I think that concern frightened Julian more than anything I might have said myself. 3 days later, she was dismissed, replaced with Nora, who I believe was instructed from the beginning to report anything unusual directly to my mother rather than showing any independent loyalty toward me. And Dr. Whitfield? He arrived the same week Margaret was dismissed. At first, the tonic he gave me was mild, meant only to help me sleep, or so I was told, but as the weeks passed, and I continued to resist the marriage in whatever small ways remained available to me, the dosages increased. I began losing entire days to that fog. I stopped being able to trust my own memory of what had happened during certain hours. I stopped being able to trust my own body to respond the way I asked it to. She paused, looking down at the faded bruises still visible on her wrist, fading now but not yet fully gone. The wounds came from Julian mostly, never anything that would leave permanent damage visible to outsiders, always careful, always calculated, a grip too tight during a private conversation, a shove against a doorframe when no one else was present to witness it. He was very careful, Your Grace. He understood exactly how much harm he could cause without leaving evidence that could not be easily explained away as clumsiness or the natural fragility that comes with poor health. And your mother knew. My mother chose not to see it, which I have come to understand is its own kind of choice, regardless of how she might explain it to herself. She wanted this marriage to happen as desperately as Julian did, though for slightly different reasons. She believed, I think, that whatever suffering I experienced in the process would be forgotten entirely once I became a duchess, comfortable and secure, the family's debts cleared, and its reputation restored. She was not prepared, I believe, for how far Julian was willing to go to ensure that outcome, nor how much damage would be done to me along the way. Edmund reached forward and took her hand gently, careful of the healing wound along her wrist. You survived months of this, entirely alone, and still found the strength to send that message when everything else seemed to be collapsing around you. I did not feel strong, Your Grace. I felt utterly powerless, most days. I only knew that whatever came from trusting you could not possibly be worse than what continuing to stay silent had already cost me. You may call me Edmund, he said softly. I believe we have moved well beyond formal titles between us. A faint smile touched Evelina's lips, the first genuine smile Edmund had seen from her since their engagement began. Edmund, then. Over the following week, while Evelina continued her recovery at Cambourne Hall, Frederick Lowell worked tirelessly to build a formal case against Julian Ashworth and Dr. Whitfield, gathering sworn testimony from Margaret Finch and Mrs. Pierce, compiling Dr. Wren's medical analysis alongside additional statements from other household staff who, once Julian's authority had visibly begun crumbling, found themselves suddenly willing to speak honestly about what they had witnessed over recent months. The case that emerged was damning and comprehensive. Julian Ashworth faced charges of fraud related to the deliberate concealment of family debts used to pressure his stepsister into an unwanted marriage, alongside charges of assault stemming from the physical harm inflicted upon her throughout the engagement period. Dr. Whitfield faced professional censure severe enough to end his medical career entirely, along with criminal charges related to the administration of dangerous substances without proper consent or medical justification. Lady Ashworth, though not facing formal criminal charges herself, found her social standing collapsing rapidly as word of the scandal spread through London's drawing rooms and dinner parties, the careful reputation she had spent years cultivating crumbling within a matter of weeks under the weight of what her own daughter's suffering revealed about the household she had presided over. Julian was arrested 10 days after the confrontation at the Ashworth estate, taken from the family home in full view of neighbors who had once regarded the Ashworth family with considerable respect, and now watched with undisguised curiosity as their carefully maintained facade collapsed entirely into public scandal. Evelina learned of the arrest from Edmund himself, who delivered the news gently during one of his daily visits to her chamber, watching her face carefully for whatever reaction the news might produce. "How do you feel, knowing it is finally over?" he asked, once she had absorbed the information in silence for several long moments. "Relieved," she said slowly, testing the word against feelings still complicated and difficult to fully untangle. "And sad, in ways I did not expect to feel. He is still my stepbrother. We were close once, before our father died and everything between us changed. I do not know how to hold both feelings at once, the relief and the sorrow, but I suppose I will need to learn. You do not need to resolve that feeling quickly, or neatly, Edmund said. Grief for what a person once was, alongside relief that they can no longer cause harm, is not a contradiction. It is simply the complicated truth of loving someone who has become dangerous. Evelina studied him for a long moment, something warm and grateful moving behind her eyes. You understand people remarkably well, for a man who built such a careful, distant reputation before all of this began. Edmund's expression turned slightly rueful. I built that reputation because it was easier than allowing people close enough to disappoint me, or to be disappointed by. My father's death taught me caution at a very young age. I did not expect an arranged marriage to teach me anything different. And has it? It has taught me, Edmund said quietly, that some things are worth the risk of being disappointed. That watching someone else's suffering and choosing to act, rather than remaining safely distant, is worth more than any careful reputation I might have preserved by looking away. Evelina's hand found his without conscious thought, her fingers intertwining with his own. I am grateful you did not look away, Edmund. More grateful than I know how to properly express. You do not need to express it, he said, his voice gentle. You only need to continue healing, and to decide, when you are ready, what you actually want your future to hold, entirely apart from anything your family once demanded of you. That evening, alone in her chamber after Edmund had taken his leave, Evelina sat by the window and watched the sun set over Cambourne Hall's extensive gardens, feeling something she had not experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. Not fear, not the careful, exhausting performance of contentment she had maintained for months to survive her own household. Something closer to genuine peace, fragile still but real, growing slowly stronger with each day further removed from the danger she had lived within for so long. The wedding that had once been forced upon her as a solution to her family's desperate finances no longer existed on any calendar. What remained now was simply a question neither she nor Edmund had yet fully addressed, though both of them, in their own quiet ways, had begun to consider what an answer to that question might actually look like, freely chosen, rather than imposed by circumstance or desperate necessity. 3 weeks after Julian's arrest, the formal hearing convened at the county court, a proceeding far more public than Evelina had hoped, though Frederick Lowell had warned her from the beginning that a case of this nature, involving a titled family and a duke's direct intervention, would inevitably draw considerable attention regardless of anyone's preferences for discretion. Evelina insisted on attending, despite Edmund's gentle suggestion that she might be spared the ordeal by allowing the written testimony already gathered to stand on its own. I have spent months being spoken about, decided for, managed as though I had no voice of my own in what happened to me, she told him, the morning of the hearing, dressed carefully in dark green rather than white, a deliberate choice she had made without needing to explain it aloud. I will not sit at home while others determine the consequences. I want to be present. I want him to see me stand and speak the truth myself. Edmund had not argued further, understanding the importance of what she was asking for, and had simply arranged for Dr. Wren to remain close throughout the proceedings, ready to intervene should the strain prove too much for her still recovering strength. The courtroom was crowded, word of the scandal having spread widely enough that curious onlookers filled every available seat, eager to witness the public unraveling of a family whose careful reputation had once seemed unassailable. Julian sat across the room, his usual composed confidence entirely absent, replaced by a hollow, calculating watchfulness that reminded Evelina uncomfortably of the man who had gripped her arm hard enough to bruise, all those months ago, promising consequences she would regret if she dared refuse the marriage he needed her to accept. Margaret Finch testified first, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness at addressing such a formal proceeding, describing clearly and without exaggeration exactly what she had witnessed in the weeks before her dismissal. Mrs. Pierce followed, her testimony corroborating much of what Margaret had described, along with additional details regarding the tonic's regular administration and the household's careful efforts to conceal Evelina's declining condition from outside observers. Dr. Wren presented his medical analysis with clinical precision, explaining in terms the court could clearly understand exactly what the tonic had contained, and what sustained exposure at increasing dosages would have done to a young woman's body and mind over the timeline described. When it came time for Evelina herself to testify, she rose from her seat beside Edmund with hands that trembled slightly, though her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a clarity and steadiness that surprised even herself. She described the argument following her initial refusal of the marriage. She described the bruises that followed, the dismissal of the maid who had noticed them, the gradual escalation of the tonic's dosage as her resistance persisted despite every effort to silence it. She described the fear that had governed nearly every waking moment of her final months within her own family's household, the careful performance of contentment she had maintained at every dinner, every fitting, every social occasion where appearing anything less than a joyfully willing bride would have invited consequences she had learned, through painful experience, she could not survive. Julian's solicitor attempted, briefly, to suggest that Evelina's account might be colored by the very sedation she was describing, that her memories from that period could not be entirely trusted given the substances involved. But Dr. Wren's testimony regarding the specific timeline of dosages, combined with the consistency of Evelina's account alongside Margaret's and Mrs. Pierce's independent testimony, left little room for the argument to gain any real traction with the presiding magistrate. The hearing concluded after 2 full days of testimony, and the verdict, when it finally arrived a week later, confirmed everything Edmund and Evelina had hoped for, though the relief it brought carried its own complicated weight. Julian Ashworth was found guilty of fraud and assault, sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment that would ensure he posed no further threat to Evelina or anyone else for many years to come. Dr. Whitfield's medical license was permanently revoked, and he faced separate criminal proceedings for his role in administering dangerous substances without proper consent, a case that would likely end his freedom alongside his career. Lady Ashworth escaped formal criminal charges, the evidence against her insufficient to prove direct participation in the physical harm inflicted upon her daughter, though the court's findings regarding her willful blindness to what was happening within her own household ensured that whatever social standing she had once enjoyed would never fully recover. She wrote to Evelina twice in the weeks following the verdict, letters full of justification and self-pity rather than genuine apology, and Evelina, after careful consideration, chose not to respond to either one, understanding finally that some relationships could not be salvaged simply through the passage of time, and that protecting her own continued healing sometimes required accepting that certain doors were better left closed. Clara, her youngest sister, was a different matter entirely, too young to have been complicit in anything that happened, and clearly frightened and confused by the scandal that had consumed her family. Evelina made arrangements through Frederick Lowell to ensure Clara's continued education and well-being remained secure regardless of whatever else happened to the rest of the family. Visiting her regularly at the small cottage where she now lived under the care of a trusted aunt, determined that her sister, at least, would not carry forward the same silence and fear that had nearly consumed Evelina herself. In the weeks following the hearing, as autumn settled fully over Cambourne Hall's gardens and the last of the summer roses gave way to chrysanthemums, Evelina found herself growing steadily stronger, both physically and in ways less easily measured. The trembling in her hands disappeared entirely. Her appetite returned in full, color filling out her once gaunt features until she scarcely resembled the frightened, fading young woman who had first caught Edmund's attention at that fateful dinner months earlier. She began writing again, something she had loved before her stepfather's death and the difficult years that followed, and Edmund often joined her, the two of them exploring the extensive Cambourne estate together, in comfortable, easy silence that required no careful performance between them. Their relationship, built now on honesty rather than obligation, deepened steadily during this period of recovery and healing. Edmund made no mention of the wedding that had once loomed over both their lives as an unwanted obligation, understanding intuitively that Evelina needed time and genuine choice before any conversation about marriage could hold real meaning, rather than simply repeating the pattern of decisions made for her by others. It was Evelina herself, finally, who raised the subject one crisp autumn afternoon, as they walked together through the same gardens where Edmund had first asked to see her wrist, months earlier, in a conversation that had changed the entire course of both their lives. "I have been thinking," she said, pausing near the same fountain where she had once waited nervously for a duke she barely knew, dressed carefully in gloves, meant to hide bruises rather than adorn her hands, "about what I actually want for my future, now that I am finally permitted to consider the question honestly." Edmund stopped beside her, giving her his full attention, careful as always not to press or assume where her thoughts might be leading. "And what have you concluded?" "That I do not regret the marriage that was once planned for us, strange as that may sound, given everything that surrounded it." She turned to face him fully, her eyes clear and steady in a way that would have been impossible during those first frightened weeks of their acquaintance. "I regret entirely the reasons behind it, the fear and desperation that shaped it, the choice that was taken from me before I ever had the chance to consider what I might genuinely want. But you, Edmund, specifically, are not something I regret at all." Something shifted in Edmund's expression, cautious hope replacing the careful neutrality he had maintained throughout their months of friendship and healing. "What are you saying, Evelina?" "I am saying that if you were to ask me now, freely, without any pressure from my family or yours, without any debt to settle or reputation to secure, whether I wish to marry you, I believe my answer would be yes. Not because it is expected or convenient or necessary for anyone's survival, but because these past months, getting to know you honestly, without the weight of obligation between us, have taught me that you are a man worth choosing, entirely apart from any circumstance that first brought us together." Edmund reached for her hands, holding them gently, mindful still of the wrist that had once carried such visible evidence of her suffering, now healed completely, the skin smooth and unmarked once more. "I have wanted to ask you properly since the day you told me your full story, but I did not want you to feel any pressure, any sense of obligation carrying forward from the arrangement that first bound us together. I wanted you to reach this moment entirely on your own terms." "I have," she said softly. "I am here, entirely on my own terms, telling you exactly what I want." Edmund knelt then, right there beside the fountain, still holding her hands carefully in his own. "Evelina Ashworth, will you marry me? Not because your family requires it, not because mine expects it, but because I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever anticipated when this arrangement first began, and because I cannot imagine my future without you genuinely choosing to share it with me." Tears filled Evelina's eyes, though these were entirely different from the frightened, exhausted tears that had marked so much of her recent past. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and certain. "Yes, Edmund, I choose you. Freely, completely, exactly as you have asked." In the weeks before the wedding, Evelina insisted on one final visit to Marrow's End, wanting to deliver Margaret Finch's invitation in person, rather than through a formal letter carried by a servant. Edmund accompanied her, understanding the significance of the gesture, and watched as Evelina embraced the woman who had cared for her since childhood, both of them weeping openly on the small cottage doorstep, in a reunion that needed no words to convey its depth. "I never thought I would see you looking so well again," Margaret said, holding Evelina at arm's length to study her properly, taking in the color return to her cheeks, the steadiness in her hands, the genuine light in her eyes that had been entirely absent during those final desperate months at the Ashworth estate. "You look like yourself again, my lady. The girl I remember from before all of this began. I feel like myself again," Evelina admitted, "some days more than others, but it grows easier with time." "And you," Margaret said, turning her attention to Edmund with the frank assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading character in the households she served. "You kept your word to me, Your Grace. Not every man of your standing would have bothered protecting a dismissed servant's family the way you promised." "I meant every word I said to you that morning, Mrs. Finch. You took a considerable risk speaking honestly with a stranger who arrived unannounced at your door. I could do no less than honor that courage." Margaret's eyes glistened further at this, and she insisted both of them stay for tea before they departed, filling the small cottage with warm conversation and genuine laughter that stood in stark contrast to the careful, fearful silence that had once governed every interaction within the Ashworth household. On the return journey to Cambourne Hall, Evelina sat quietly beside Edmund in the carriage, watching the countryside pass by in comfortable silence for several minutes, before finally speaking what had clearly been weighing on her mind. "I have decided something," she said, "about my mother." Edmund waited, giving her space to continue without pressing. "I do not think I will ever fully forgive what she allowed to happen, the choice she made, again and again, to look away from evidence she surely must have noticed on some level, regardless of how convincingly she has managed to justify it to herself. But I also do not wish to carry that particular weight forward into whatever life I am building now, with you. I think, for my own sake rather than hers, I need to release the anger, even if I cannot offer the reconciliation she has been asking for in her letters." "That sounds like considerable wisdom, for someone who has endured what you have these past months." "It does not feel wise most days. It feels simply necessary, if I want the life ahead of me to be defined by what I am building, rather than what I survived." She turned to look at him fully, something settled and peaceful in her expression that had grown steadily more present with each passing week. "I want our marriage, and whatever family we build together, to exist entirely apart from the fear and desperation that shaped my previous understanding of what family could mean." Edmund brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "Then that is precisely what we shall build, together, on our own terms, exactly as you have chosen for yourself." The final weeks before the wedding passed quickly, filled with quiet, joyful preparation, entirely unlike the anxious, fearful planning that had once surrounded her first engagement. Clara stayed at Cambourne Hall for much of this period, delighting in the gardens, the horses, and most especially in watching her older sister laugh freely again, something Clara herself admitted she had feared she might never witness again after the difficult months that had preceded Julian's arrest. "I used to lie awake at night," Clara confessed one evening, curled beside Evelina on a window seat overlooking the darkened gardens, wondering if you would ever be happy again. "You seemed so far away, even when you were sitting right beside me." Evelina wrapped an arm around her younger sister, drawing her close. "I am here now, Clara. Entirely here, entirely present, and I intend to remain that way for as long as you need me. Promise?" "I promise." Frederick Lowell visited twice during these final weeks, updating Edmund and Evelina on the formal conclusion of Julian's case, and ensuring all legal matters related to the Ashworth estate's remaining debts and Clara's continued guardianship arrangements were properly settled. Evelina listened to these updates with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout the formal hearing, no longer flinching at the mention of Julian's name, though the sorrow beneath her composure never fully disappeared, simply settling into something she had learned to carry alongside her growing happiness, rather than allowing it to overshadow everything else. Attended only by those who had genuinely earned a place in their lives, rather than the sprawling guest list her mother had once assembled to impress society with the family's supposed prosperity. Margaret Finch attended as an honored guest rather than a dismissed servant, weeping openly through the entire ceremony. Mrs. Pierce came as well, having accepted a position within the Cambourne household staff once her role in exposing the truth had made her continued employment with the Ashworth family impossible. Clara stood beside her sister as the sole bridesmaid, radiant with genuine happiness rather than the anxious confusion that had marked her presence at the earlier forced engagement. Evelina wore a simple gown, far less elaborate than the elaborate white silk creation that had once carried her blood into its fabric, choosing instead something that reflected her own preferences rather than any performance for wedding guests she barely knew. She wore no gloves, her wrists bare and healed, unmarked by anything except the natural creases of skin that had known genuine rest and safety for months now, rather than the careful concealment that had once defined every public appearance she made. As Edmund placed the ring on her finger, exchanging vows freely chosen rather than obligated, Evelina found herself thinking of that first dinner, months earlier, when a duke she barely knew had noticed a bloodstain on her sleeve and had not simply looked away. She thought of Margaret's testimony, of Mrs. Pierce's quiet courage in obtaining the sample that had ultimately proven everything, of Dr. Wren's steady medical expertise that had given weight to her own account when her family had tried so hard to dismiss it as nerves and exhaustion. She thought, too, of Julian, serving his sentence now in circumstances considerably less comfortable than the estate he had once fought so desperately to preserve, and found that whatever complicated grief remained regarding the stepbrother she had once known had settled, finally, into something she could carry, without it consuming her entirely. He had made his choices, understanding fully the harm they would cause, and the consequences he now faced were entirely his own to bear. Her mother had not been invited to the wedding, a decision Evelina had made carefully and without regret, understanding that some relationships required distance rather than reconciliation in order for genuine healing to continue. She had written once more, after the wedding announcement appeared in the newspapers, a brief letter offering congratulations that felt more like an attempt at reasserting connection than genuine warmth. Evelina had read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she did not intend to open again anytime soon, understanding that forgiveness, if it ever came, would need to arrive on her own timeline rather than anyone else's expectation. As the ceremony concluded and the small gathering of genuine friends and allies celebrated around them, Edmund drew Evelina aside for a quiet moment, away from the joyful noise, his hand finding hers once more. "How do you feel?" he asked, echoing the question he had first asked her at that fateful dinner so many months earlier, though everything about the circumstances surrounding it had transformed entirely. Evelina considered the question seriously, taking stock of everything she felt in this moment, standing beside a man who had seen her at her most frightened and vulnerable and had chosen, again and again, to act rather than look away. "Free," she said finally, the word carrying weight far beyond its simple syllable. "For the first time in longer than I can properly remember, I feel entirely, genuinely, free." Edmund pressed a gentle kiss to her bare wrist, the same wrist that had once carried such visible evidence of her suffering, now marked by nothing except the warmth of his affection and the quiet promise of a future built entirely on honesty, choice, and genuine care rather than obligation or fear. "Then that," he said softly, is precisely how it should be. In the months that followed their wedding, Cambourne Hall gradually filled with the sound of genuine laughter, something the estate had not fully known since before Edmund's father's death, had first taught him the caution and distance that once defined his reputation throughout society. Evelina's strength continued returning fully, her rides across the estate grounds growing longer and more adventurous, as autumn gave way to winter and then, eventually, to a spring that felt like genuine renewal rather than simply the passage of another season. She maintained regular contact with Clara, ensuring her sister's continued well-being and education remained secure, and slowly, carefully, began rebuilding a version of family that felt safe rather than obligatory, one chosen relationship at a time, rather than the tangled web of debt and fear that had once defined her understanding of family entirely. Margaret Finch, now comfortably settled with a small pension Edmund had arranged in gratitude for her courage, visited Cambourne Hall regularly, and Evelina found genuine joy in these visits, reconnecting with the woman who had cared for her since childhood, this time as equals rather than mistress and servant, bound together by shared history and genuine affection rather than simple obligation. Dr. Whitfield's criminal proceedings concluded with a lengthy prison sentence, ensuring he would never again hold a position allowing him access to vulnerable patients, desperate enough to trust him with their care. Julian remained in prison, his once comfortable life reduced entirely to the consequences of choices he had made, with full understanding of the harm they would cause. And Evelina, finally free from the fear and desperation that had once governed nearly every aspect of her existence, discovered slowly, patiently, exactly what genuine happiness could look like, built not on the desperate performance of contentment she had once maintained to survive, but on real safety, real choice, and a partnership freely chosen by two people who had found, in each other, something worth building an entire future around. The blood that had once stained white silk, the bruises that had once required careful concealment beneath long gloves, the fear that had once shaped every careful word and gesture, all of it belonged now to a past she had survived, rather than a present she continued to endure. And in its place stood something far stronger, forged through honesty, courage, and the willingness of one man to notice suffering others had chosen to ignore, and to act, decisively and completely, until justice and genuine safety had finally been secured. Their story, which had begun with fear disguised as wedding anxiety, ended instead exactly as genuine love stories should, with two people choosing each other freely, completely, and without any shadow of obligation darkening the happiness they had both fought so hard to finally claim. A year passed at Cambourne Hall, marked by the quiet, steady rhythms of a household finally settled into genuine peace. Evelina had thrown herself into learning the full responsibilities of managing the estate alongside Edmund, discovering in the process a sharp, capable mind that had simply never been given room to flourish during the anxious, controlled years of her earlier life. She oversaw improvements to the tenant cottages scattered across Cambourne's land, insisted on better wages for the household staff who had shown such loyalty during the difficult months of her recovery, and found genuine satisfaction in work that asked nothing of her except honest effort and clear thinking. Clara visited often, no longer the frightened, uncertain child who had once curled beside Evelina in the dark, whispering worried questions about wedding anxiety and vanishing happiness. She had grown taller, more confident, her education progressing well under the care of tutors Edmund had arranged, and she spoke now with the easy assurance of a girl who understood, finally, that her family's future no longer depended on anyone's suffering or silence. Margaret Finch became a regular presence at Cambourne Hall as well, her small pension allowing her comfortable independence while her visits provided Evelina with a steady connection to the woman who had cared for her since childhood. The two of them often walked together through the gardens during these visits, discussing everything from estate matters to simple gossip, the easy comfort between them a testament to loyalty that had survived even the darkest period of Evelina's life. Mrs. Pierce, settled now permanently into her role managing Cambourne Hall's household staff, brought with her the same quiet competence and genuine care that had once made her willing to risk everything to help expose the truth of what Evelina had endured. Under her guidance, the household ran with warmth and efficiency, a stark contrast to the tense, fearful atmosphere that had once defined the Ashworth estate. Word occasionally reached Cambourne Hall regarding Julian's continued imprisonment, updates from Frederick Lowell confirming that his sentence proceeded as expected, with no indication of early release given the severity of the charges against him. Evelina received this news each time with the same steady composure, no longer disturbed by mention of his name, though she never expressed any desire to visit him or re-establish contact of any kind. Some doors, she had come to understand, were meant to remain closed, not out of continued fear, but simply because reopening them would serve no genuine purpose beyond reintroducing pain she had already worked so hard to move beyond. Her mother wrote periodically throughout that first year, letters that gradually shifted in tone from justification towards something that might, with considerable generosity, be called genuine reflection. Evelina read each letter carefully before filing it away unanswered, uncertain whether she would ever feel ready to respond, but no longer troubled by the uncertainty itself. She had learned, through everything she survived, that healing did not require resolving every relationship neatly, that some wounds simply needed time and distance rather than forced reconciliation before they could fully close. On a bright morning in early summer, just over a year after their wedding, Evelina found Edmund in his study, reviewing correspondence related to the estate's autumn harvest preparations. She entered quietly, closing the door behind her, something in her expression causing him to set aside his papers immediately and give her his full attention. "You look as though you have news," he said, studying her face with the careful attention that had defined their relationship from its very beginning. "I do," she said, unable to fully suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "Dr. Wren confirmed it this morning, when I asked him to examine me privately." Edmund rose from his desk immediately, crossing the room to stand before her, understanding dawning in his expression even before she spoke the words aloud. "Evelina, we are going to have a child," she said, watching joy transform his careful, composed features into something open and unguarded, in a way she had rarely witnessed even during their year of genuine happiness together. Sometime in early winter, Dr. Wren believes, based on his examination. Edmund gathered her carefully into his arms, his joy evident in every line of his body, though his hold remained gentle, mindful always of protecting her comfort above everything else. "This is the finest news I believe I have ever received." "I was frightened when I first suspected," Evelina admitted, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "Frightened that bringing a child into the world might somehow reawaken fears I thought I had finally moved beyond. But standing here now, I find I feel only happiness. Genuine, uncomplicated happiness, exactly as it should be. Our child," Edmund said softly, his hand resting gently against her still flat stomach, "will grow up knowing only safety, and love, and the genuine freedom to make their own choices about their own future. I promise you that, Evelina, as completely as I promised to protect you the day I first saw the truth you had been hiding beneath silk gloves." Evelina lifted her face to meet his eyes, finding there the same steady devotion that had carried them both through the darkest months of her life, and into whatever bright future now stretched ahead of them. "I believe you completely." News of the pregnancy spread quickly through Cambourne Hall's household, bringing fresh joy to a home that had already known considerable healing over the preceding year. Clara, upon hearing the news during her next visit, wept happy tears and immediately began planning elaborate schemes for spoiling her future niece or nephew, much to Evelina's amused affection. Margaret Finch offered practical advice drawn from decades of experience within households welcoming new arrivals, while Mrs. Pierce quietly began preparing the nursery, ensuring every detail would be ready long before the child's expected arrival. Autumn arrived, then began its slow transition toward winter, and Evelina's pregnancy progressed smoothly under Dr. Wren's careful attention. The same steady expertise that had once helped save her life, now devoted to ensuring the safe arrival of the next generation of the Cambourne family. Edmund remained close throughout this period, adjusting his own responsibilities to spend considerable time simply present alongside her, reading together by the fire during the increasingly cold evenings, discussing hopeful plans for the child's future that felt entirely different from the anxious, controlled planning that had once governed every aspect of Evelina's earlier life. On a snowy morning in December, nearly 14 months after their wedding day, Evelina gave birth to a healthy daughter, her cries filling Cambourne Hall with sound that Edmund would later describe as the finest music he had ever heard. They named her Margaret, in honor of the woman whose loyalty and courage had played such an essential role in Evelina's survival and eventual freedom, and the elder Margaret wept openly with pride and joy when informed of the tribute, holding the newest addition to the family with hands that had once braided a frightened young girl's hair and were now blessed with the privilege of welcoming that same girl's own daughter into the world. Watching Evelina hold their daughter close that first evening, exhaustion and joy mingling openly across her features, Edmund found himself thinking back to that first dinner, so many months earlier, when he had noticed blood soaking through white silk and had chosen, against every careful instinct that had governed his life until that moment, to act rather than simply look away. He had expected, entering their arranged engagement, Nothing more than a practical partnership built on mutual convenience. He had found instead a love built on genuine courage, honesty, and the shared understanding that comes only from surviving darkness together and choosing, deliberately and completely, to build something bright and lasting in its place. "Thank you," Evelina murmured that evening, looking up from their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face to meet Edmund's eyes across the quiet nursery. "For everything. For noticing, when everyone else in my life had chosen not to see. For acting, when it would have been so much easier to simply proceed with the wedding and look away from whatever suffering I was trying so desperately to hide." Edmund knelt beside her chair, pressing a gentle kiss first to their daughter's small forehead, then to Evelina's own. "There is nothing to thank me for, my love. You survived the darkest circumstances imaginable, through your own strength and courage. I simply refuse to let that strength go unnoticed, or unanswered." Outside, snow continued falling softly over Camborne Hall's gardens, blanketing the fountain where Edmund had once knelt to ask Evelina, freely and completely, to share her life with him. Inside, warmth and genuine love filled every corner of the home they had built together. A family finally whole, finally safe, finally free from every shadow that had once threatened to consume everything good and hopeful within it. Their story had begun with blood hidden beneath silk gloves and desperate, fearful silence. It continued now, and would continue for many years to come, written instead in the language of genuine safety, chosen love, and the unbreakable devotion of two people who had found, in each other, exactly the courage needed to build a future worth every difficult step it had taken to finally reach it.